Good morning, everyone. Hi there. How are you? Good to see you out there in the chat already. Oh, good to see we've got 30 people tuning in already. I thought I'd do an experiment today and see what would happen if I didn't provide a last minute reminder that we were going live and whether or not people would plan to come on in. So for the 30 people that are here, you might have quite the little private session to yourselves. And with me, we'll see how we go, and that will be good to answer your questions. Feel free to jump on into the chat and say hello. We're a bit dark, aren't we? Let me lighten things up a tad. Oh, getting darker. Oh, getting lighter. There we go. A little bit better. Okay. Hello, Monica. Welcome along. How are you all doing? How are you all doing in the context of COVID craziness and lockdown and all of these sorts of things? You doing okay? It's a little bit like Groundhog Day, isn't it? Certainly, everything feels just like a copy of the day before at the moment. And to tell you the truth, I don't know if I've ever been, there's probably times where I've been this busy in my life, but it's certainly pushing the envelope. And it's a weird space to be in when you're sort of, to give you an insight into my typical day. I'm getting up at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning and coming straight into my office here, which the commute just involves me walking to the other end of the house from the bedroom, and I'm sure that's the case for so many people. And then I find myself, if it's anything like yesterday, just being in here all day and into the evening, working on things. And I probably need to get a little bit better at that. And to tell you the truth, I will next week. Next week, things will start to slow down. But for now, I seem to be living in these four walls, which are not necessarily as pretty as you can see on the camera here. Let me, how do I swivel my camera so you can, if I turn you over this way, you can see my exercise bike there. It's very, very glamorous. And we'll swivel back this way, and there's my bookshelf over there with a bunch of books and things on it. But now it looks prettier, except for my old mug. How are you doing out there? Hey, do I have strategies for looking after my mental health? That's a really good question. Yes, I absolutely do, Adam. And that's something we're going to be talking about in our upcoming practical class. Yes, next week's practical class. So in next week's class, we're going to look at the DAX Online exhibition. And I'm hoping, well, I'll need you to, before the class next week, go and spend some time having a look at the online gallery space that I built for you this week, and consider the works by the artists and the artist stories. And next week's practical class will involve discussion of what you thought, and also of how you think what you've explored might relate to what you're writing about in your lab report. And we're going to finish off the class by talking about some of the signs and experiences that we can be looking out for ourselves to know when we might be under stress, be able to especially benefit from taking some time out or doing practical things to look after our mental health. And we'll be talking about what some of those things could be and how to access support if you're in need of support as well. So that will be coming up in next week's practical classes. Hi, Callie. Oh, I'm glad you've enjoyed the DAX Gallery space. It's wonderful that, so the backstory is that I was able to get my hands on some funding to support the development of that space and the licensing of the images and the works and so forth, and to support the work that the DAX crew did in providing that to us. And tomorrow behind the scenes, oh no, wait, today, it's all blurry. Today at 1 o'clock, the DAX Gallery team will be meeting with myself and with your tutors, and we're going to discuss the gallery space together and prepare for the practical classes next week. So thankfully we got some funding to do that and made it happen. And that was so important. It's such an important part of the Hearing Voices program and part of this clinical psychology component of mind, brain, and behavior too. And obviously just another way in which we're valuing lived experience in the curriculum, and something that I didn't want you to miss out on because of COVID and the fact that we couldn't actually get along to the gallery. When COVID's over and you're able to come to campus again, do go and see the DAX Gallery. It's a wonderful resource that we have on campus, and it's definitely worth a visit. I see not a little silhouette of a man, but an interesting question that I've been getting asked a bit. So let me answer Chili's question about the book, The Stigma of Mental Illness, End of Story. What part of that you're supposed to read? I've been getting a couple of questions about that, and I don't know if people know that there is a can I share my screen on this? Oh no, I'm not doing it that way. Okay. At the very top of the clinical psychology module, just above the Hearing Voices section, you will find the clinical psychology overview document, which lays out the lectures, the practical classes, the readings, and so forth. And so it is chapter 24 that you are after, Chili, and you'll find a description of the recommended and prescribed readings in that document in the clinical psychology section. Monica's right. Chapter 24, it's all about interventions that work for mental illness stigma reduction, and has got quite a bit on education and contact-based interventions in there. A lot of this feels like studying myself. Yeah, isn't that true, Holly? I think that's one of the reasons why psychology is so easy to get hooked on and so fascinating, that it is ultimately all about ourselves. And I've mentioned in passing that, you know, as we go into this exploration of mental health issues and different diagnoses and different areas of mental illness, what we are actually talking about when we look at signs and symptoms are very commonly quite extreme forms of experience that are part of our everyday lives, a part of things that we experience on a daily basis. And I said in response to a question on, I think it was in Piazza, or it might have been in the perusal paper. Anyway, somewhere I've written a little bit that I like to talk about. I'm going to talk about in next week's class around personality, where so many of these things, you know, that we're talking about are extensions of everyday life and experiences we all have. And in fact, if you really broaden your conception of mental health issues beyond the framework of the DSM-5. So if we think about sort of that as representing maybe diagnosable conditions according to its classification system, and we could think in a different way. And of course, I've been trying to introduce you to different ways of thinking about the classification of mental health issues. But if you broaden your approach and you think about this as, I suppose, more liberally, and maybe draw a parallel or a comparison to physical health issues, I think it's really likely that probably everybody in Mind, Brain and Behavior 2 by this age would have experienced some degree of mental health issue. So if you think about physical health as a comparison again, think about, sometimes you might have had a cold, relatively fleeting. You might have had a sniffle and a sore throat that was sort of gone and came and gone in one day. Maybe a fleeting small physical health issue, but a physical health issue nonetheless. A more extreme version of that, a diagnosable version of that, might be something like COVID, for example, the condition that would arise from contracting the COVID virus. So I suppose the difference would be degrees of impact on functioning and severity and whatnot. But when you think about it that way, it sort of creates less of a dichotomy, less of an us and them type way of thinking about mental disorder and mental health issues. So the way in which I like to think about mental health issues is certainly on a bit more of a continuum basis, a more or less over time. I think that's how our experience really goes. We're all sort of more or less mentally healthy over time, and that fluctuates according to a range of factors, as we know. And certainly, as I was saying about the tutorials next week, some of the things that we can do to maintain our mental health is certainly have a look out for those early warning signs that would give us an idea that maybe we need to work on our mental health and to prevent things from getting worse. So let's have a look here. Hello, everyone. Keeping sane, just Stephen says. Yeah, I know how you feel, Stephen. Paul, missing your gym. Oh, there you go. Yeah, I imagine. Oh, of course, gyms would be hit hard by COVID, wouldn't they? That's a really difficult industry. Lots of touch points, right? Shared touch points. I can understand that. Can you get out and exercise around where you're living at all, or do some exercise in the house? Hey, Daniel. How you're asking a good question here. How do we account for the fact that the results might be influenced by our knowledge of the experiment's purpose, possibly respondents giving the right response? That is an issue, isn't it? It's almost like some devious lecturer and researcher intentionally built flaws into the research design and left them there for you to find. Curious. So yeah, something you might want to talk about in your limitations section. I think somebody mentioned that down the track. Do I think hi Sarah, do I think moving towards dimensional diagnosis and early intervention is correlated with giving people a sense of this continuum, therefore decreasing stigma? I think a continuum conceptualization is fundamental to subverting stigma. So the fundamental, I suppose, mechanism of stigma is whatever the stigmatized thing is different to me. But if you can subvert that and draw out, in this case, what I believe is true, and a lot of evidence points to this, that we are talking about continuums of experience. And sure, at a certain point, for the purpose of clinical utility, we need to introduce some categorical conceptualization to this to create a structured framework within which to operate. But yes, I think that if we can blur the lines of difference, and not in not a fantastical way, in a really valid way, I think we've got that evidence to make that case, then yeah, you subvert stigma. The early intervention thing can be a little bit problematic around stigma in that it in itself creates or sets up a bit of a dichotomy. So practically, we're aiming to intervene early for people who are at risk, but then it sets up a bit of a conceptual dichotomy with those people that we can help via an early intervention paradigm and people who, at this point in time, it's too late to help via an early intervention paradigm and who are already living with severe and complex conditions. And in that respect can set up an unintended but problematic dichotomy that's stigmatizing. And, if you watch, I sent those links out yesterday with those links to Nick Haslam and Fabian Fabiano's paper and the 2 previous Psych Talks events. If you watch those Psych Talks events, and particularly the one in Shepparton, which was from last year, you'll hear Georgie Harmon, who's the CEO of Beyond Blue, and Michelle Blanchard, who's the Deputy CEO of Sane Australia, talking about how Beyond Blue's done a lot of wonderful work to destigmatize, in particular, the experience of anxiety and depression and the experience of thoughts of suicide and so forth. And in doing so, have opened up a lot of culture level discourse across the country and have improved our willingness to seek help around anxiety and depression, have essentially really influenced these experiences as being culturally sanctioned and appropriate ways to experience and express psychological distress. However, and they've been well supported by the government in doing that work. And that is Beyond Blue's portfolio, those high prevalence disorders. And appropriately so, they've really run with it over the last 15, 20 years and done amazing work. However, in the doing, what we might have done is establish one of these problematic dichotomies where we start thinking about those issues as comprising acceptable mental health issues. But then when we think about lower frequency, more poorly understood conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, PTSD, OCD, and a range of other complex conditions, maybe they haven't received the same treatment, and maybe this might be one of the reasons why they are still more stigmatized. So another problematic dichotomy there. So worth a look, certainly around your lab reports, if you haven't watched that Shepparton event from last year as well. So, I mean, that interesting you should say that, Paul. So hold on to that thought. I mean, I do agree with you to a point. There's still a long way to go in certain areas. And certainly one of the ways in which cultural attitudes towards anything are perpetuated is through mass media. News reporting, fictional works and creative works and so forth that we digest en masse. We know that these things can shift cultural opinion on a range of things really easily, and certainly the experience of mental health problems. Next week, we're talking to Sandy Jeffs, and this is a book that I've just got my hands on by Sandy. Oh, is that going to focus or what? Focus. Anyway, There we go. Out of the madhouse. So it's a really good, when I say really good, I haven't really gotten through it yet. It's my job for the weekend. Account of Sandy and others' experiences in the Larundel Psychiatric Hospital, which was in Melbourne. Sandy's coming to speak with us next week. Don't forget, on Thursday. Sandy and I are doing a live stream lecture. And Sandy has been one of the, I suppose, the most vocal advocates for schizophrenia over the last 30 years or so. And yesterday we held a webinar for the National Stigma Report Card. So you remember there was those 14 life domains, and we indexed stigma across those life domains. And yesterday's webinar was all about presenting the media domain findings to the sector, and getting some feedback about the types of targeted advocacy and policy recommendations that we could develop coming out of the research findings. And Sandy was there, and Sandy made a really interesting observation, and that was that she was personally frustrated and tired of continuing to fight the battle about stigma and mental health issues some 30 years later, and really feeling like nothing much has shifted around schizophrenia. And certainly we know from some longitudinal studies of community attitudes in the United States towards schizophrenia and other mental disorders, that while attitudes towards depression have become more positive, for example, since the 1950s, attitudes towards schizophrenia have actually become worse since the 1950s. And certainly through the 1980s and all through to recently, the attitudes have become worse, which is really interesting. And one, I think, needs to look closely at the role of mass media. And Sandy will talk to us next week about her observations of what happens around stigma about schizophrenia every time somebody is reported as having committed a violent crime, and in a decontextualized fashion, mental illness is mentioned, even though the mental illness is most likely not the explanatory factor. We know that people with schizophrenia by and large are not violent, are more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators, and so forth. Yet quite often the media will present a pairing of violent crime and schizophrenia or mental illness in a decontextualized paired way, even though other factors like the person's socioeconomic background, their social, familial history, substances, and so forth are not mentioned. There's this decontextualized pairing of violent crime and mental illness and schizophrenia. It's a big problem, and it's one that we will talk about next week. I've also got a PhD student who, Kelton Hardingham is a name to keep an eye out for. His work is looking at precisely how internet and TV news perpetuates and elicits public stigma about schizophrenia. Yeah, it's a big issue. Whenever we see just one of these stories, it feels like you take 2 steps back, and then you gain 2 steps again with your anti-stigma initiatives, such as what I'm trying to embed in the curriculum here. So while I'm trying to educate you in the mind, brain, and behavior curriculum, I'm also trying to support your growth as socially responsible graduates and representatives of the university to, in the future, go out there with a range of social skills and understanding and empathy that you wouldn't have had otherwise. So my intentions for you and growth through mind, brain, and behavior too are certainly above and beyond just the knowledge. But those efforts sort of put you a step forward, and then there's a new story that puts you 2 steps back. So that was the thing that Sandy was lamenting about yesterday. We'll talk more about that in due course. But you're right. I think, we have made gains in the last 30 years, particularly around high prevalence conditions. And certainly some of the work that Beyond Blue's done recently is demonstrating that public stigma about anxiety, for example, is much higher than the self-stigma that we experience about anxiety. So they've done some interesting work looking at the experience of anxiety in emergency workers, for example, and found that emergency workers who experienced anxiety anticipated that they would experience negative events if they were to disclose that in the workplace. Yet when asking emergency workers in the workplace, would they have a problem working with somebody who experienced anxiety, I think it was like 1% of people said that they would have a problem. It was basically very little stigma about anxiety in the workplace. And, anxiety is the most common mental health issue that is getting around in our culture at this period of time. Hey, Monica, does the media do it intentionally? Yes and no. So there's I suppose you could think about this in different ways. Certainly, I think many individual reporters may not be educated. They receive a little bit of education, but Sane Australia's Stigma Watch does a lot of work to guide media reporting about severe mental illness, for example. Sensational headlines and stories sell copy, right, or make money for the newspaper via the number of times that a page was clicked on, and ad revenue and so forth. So I think there's both intentional and unintentional processes at play around media reporting. Oh, wow. Thanks for all this engagement, guys. This is great. I've just been so consistently impressed by the sensitive and responsible manner in which you've been conducting your discussions. I've been watching the Piazza board and some of the other discussions that have been going on during live streams, and I hear back from the tutors already about the sensitive way that you've been going about discussions, and that's really great. Hey, Sarah. Yeah, it's an interesting. No, not you, Siri. That's an interesting question. Why are there more females, relatively speaking, who experience anxiety? And you'll notice, of course, there are prevalence rates differences that vary according to disorder. So there are numerous reasons. One could look at biological reasons. One could look at social factors that are associated with biology and think about other particular types of social factors and stressors that females would be more likely to experience than men. So, for example, when we look at particular types of experiences like post-traumatic stress disorder and sexual assault, we know that females are at more risk than men of sexual assault historically. So biological factors, social factors, certainly psychological factors as well. And again, we talked about depression in terms of biopsychosocial ways to think about what's going on. And it's certainly, I think, a good way to think about all different types of disorders and almost everything that plugs into them. It's a very complex and nuanced set of factors that cause and lead to any particular condition. We'll talk about personality traits next week. And I find that the intersection between personality and mental health problems to be fascinating. And, that can be very much related. Personality can set the scene as a vulnerability factor for mental disorder. And of course, extreme versions of personality that are maladaptive can be thought of as disorder in itself. Hey, Sam. Yeah, that's a really good question. So how can we essentially measure whether or not reducing stigma relates to behavior change? That's a really good question. So there's numerous ways in which you can do this. Of course, when we look at social distance, we're talking about behavioral intent or theoretical behavior, I suppose. We're not actually looking at actual behavior. And I agree with you. I've long talked with actually my old PhD supervisor, Henry Jackson, about doing something together where we actually look at behavior in a research project in real life, in situation when people who who don't identify as having lived experience of any mental health issues or trauma or so forth interact with people who have received a diagnosis of schizophrenia and so forth, and do a bit of an RCT, a randomized controlled trial, give some people an intervention, give other people's some other intervention that's got nothing to do with stigma. Have a look at how the groups interact with people who do have lived experience. But there's certainly lots of evidence out there. You can look at it in a range of ways. But a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment is looking at stigma towards particular types of groups, challenging groups in the mental health system. And so stigma in clinicians towards particular groups. And we know from some of the evidence there, for example, that we do see improved behavior matching those improved attitudes and so forth towards clients from clinicians that go through intervention and so forth. All right, so I'm going to flick over to Piazza, and please keep on going into the chats, but I'm going to open up the Piazza page so that I can answer some of the questions that are in the digital mailbox. So let's have a look at what we've got lots of questions. All right, let's jump on into this. Okay, what's the sense of foreshortened future associated with PTSD? Given people's subjective experience of trauma and the similarity of many of the symptoms of PTSD with other disorders, how do we determine whether someone is dealing with PTSD as opposed to these other disorders? Is it a matter of seeing if there is a trauma experienced? Yes. So by definition, with post-traumatic stress disorder, there is a trauma, an identifiable trauma that has been experienced. And then, a range of symptoms ensue over time, potentially. I wouldn't say that the symptoms of PTSD are necessarily like those that you would see in many other disorders. Some of them are quite unique, but certainly, sure, some of the aspects around mood regulation, irritability, anxiety, hypervigilance, and whatnot can be common around anxiety and so forth. Can I elaborate a little bit on Beck's cognitive model and how the activation of schemas influence thoughts? Yeah, sure. So, influence shorts. Did I just say shorts? Holy hell! I've been watching too much Billions. You guys watch Billions? Yeah, my head's in the stock market at the moment. How schemas influence thoughts, I should say. So, as an example, I've told you about schemas and that these are these core beliefs that are developed early in childhood, and that become ways in which you just sort of view the world and assume the world to operate, come with a set of rules and assumptions that really govern the way in which you would think about the world. And whether or not those schemas are active and really influencing our thought processes on a given day would very much relate to critical events that we're experiencing in our life that may really thematically tap what that schema is about. So, for example, if you, as a child, had been really celebrated by your parents when you excelled academically, maybe when you got that A plus on, whatever the test was. And, maybe you weren't chastised for not doing well in other areas, but you were really celebrated, expressly valued and so forth when you excelled academically, and this happened time and time again. One might develop a core schema that you have to excel, be better than other people to be loved, to be worthy of love, to be valued, and so forth. So imagine there's your childhood schema, and we'll just push it down into the depths of our psyche, and we'll go ahead with our lives. And here we are in Mind, Brain, and Behavior 2. Now, what if you, at the end of Mind, Brain, and Behavior 2, you fail the exam? Or what if you fail the lab report? This is a critical event in the environment that is likely to activate that particular schema. It thematically taps that schema. So if you have failed the lab report, and you have a core belief that you must excel academically to be valued and to be a worthy, lovable person, then we have a problem. Theoretically, what we might see is that we start to see some automatic cognitions coming through, some what we'd call negative automatic thoughts that would maybe lead to depression or anxiety. Indeed, if you had this particular type of core belief and you had this particular type of experience of failing an exam, for example, you might start to think, well, if I failed this exam, then, how can I, be sort of at a deeper level? What's my value if I am not excelling academically? I don't have anything to offer people. I'm not worthy of value and love and so forth. You might be thinking that if I've failed at this exam, then I'm likely to fail at every other exam. I'm just stupid. And not only am I going to fail at every other exam, it's my fault. It's not because the exam was too hard or that COVID's happening and nobody is in a really great way of working at the moment and I can't cut myself any slack. It's because of me. I'm stupid. It's going to happen in every exam all the time. And all the time, it will always be this case. So you'd start maybe having some automatic thoughts coming that are quite negative about yourself, maybe, and about the way things that you might think about, making these sort of, we would say, attributions about yourself and about the world and about how things are going to play out over your future that might be quite depressogenic, give rise to depression. For example, you can imagine how that would influence depression. And all of those sort of negative automatic thoughts, they're all coming out of that schema. And we could address those automatic thoughts. We could question their validity. We could question if they're actually true. So is it the case that just because you failed this exam, you're going to fail every other exam? How do we know that is true? What's the evidence for that, for example? And we could also question the utility of the thought. So even if, this was true, what's the usefulness of this thought to you? Is it doing you any favors or is it causing you harm? And we could go through a process of addressing this in a number of ways, through cognitive therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, for example. And that's really where Beck operates at, around that area of cognition and particularly high prevalence disorders, although coming out of his cognitive work around depression and anxiety, he's extended a lot of work into other areas like psychosis and so forth. But hopefully that explains a little bit more about Beck's model and how a schema might work. Okay. So Monica asks, in regards to schizophrenia, why is it that women show a later onset than men? So there's lots of theories about this. One is certainly to do with hormones, for example, given that that later peak onset for females might occur around a time at which we might be expecting menopause to start to commence. And there's certainly been a lot of research around this area, but it certainly speaks to, I think, a biological component, a strong biological component there to the experience of schizophrenia. Okay, Barbara asks, according to the DSM-5, duration of symptoms for MDD, do the duration of symptoms differ for MDD and MDE? So major depressive episode and major depressive disorder, and is only one episode required to meet criteria for disorder? So yes, only one episode is required to meet criteria for the disorder. And major depressive disorder would be, the criteria for that would be met really through a process of exclusion of other diagnoses and other explanations. So if you rule out substance, you rule out a medical condition, you rule out mania, for example. If you've ruled out all of those other things, then you would be talking about major depressive disorder. Okay, so Nancy asks if positive thought disorder was a separate disorder to schizophrenia or part of the symptoms that's listed in it. Yes, so positive thought disorder is part of the symptoms of schizophrenia. It's not something different. Many of the signs and symptoms of a disorder, especially if we think cognitively and think about cognitive processes, language, they're not actually necessarily represented in the diagnostic criteria, but they can be strong features of the disorder themselves. So schizophrenia, for example, certainly incorporates positive thought disorder very commonly, pressured speech and so forth. We were talking about this the other day. There's a range of neurocognitive impairments in schizophrenia and other psychoses and all of these disorders that we've talked about, that I haven't taken you through just because there's not time. But there are many memory, language, attentional, perceptual, neurocognitive disruptions in psychosis and in schizophrenia that are associated with the experience beyond just the symptoms in the DSM-5. So for the purposes of clinical utility, which is what the DSM-5 is largely about, one doesn't need to know necessarily about all of those other things in determining what might be going on for somebody and in terms of treatment planning. But yes, it's part of schizophrenia. Okay, so Lauren asks, what's the difference between melancholy and depressed mood? Okay, so that's a really good question. So when we're talking about melancholic features in depression, Lauren, we're talking about very extreme versions of depression, I suppose. So we're talking about certainly a really a type of depressed mood that is quite qualitatively different to just a lower type mood, the way we might think about a depressed mood. Very flat, very sad. So basically, but beyond sadness, I suppose, and even described as the qualitatively different type of experience, the type of experience we would expect to see in requiring quite intense type of care in a hospital setting, for example. Yeah. Okay. Let me jump back to the stream for a second and see how we're going with the chat. Hey, thanks for that comment on the readings there, Tom. Yeah, that's right. So remember, with clinical psychology, there is just one, or really, I suppose there's two core readings. One is the Cozy Luck reading that is up in Perusal. So that is the one that's about challenging the stigma of mental illness amongst college students. So that's that's your core reading for clinical psychology. It's up there so that we can have a discussion about it in Perusal. Yes, I know I need to catch up on that discussion. I hadn't anticipated that you guys were going to take this up so much. So honestly, I've just created a bit of a problem for myself, in that I just hadn't anticipated you all would be so engaged and interested with a lot of the stuff that I am talking about. So it's been a welcome surprise, and I've certainly been playing catch up. I have finally got my email inbox. I just heard the little ping there before, so there might be a few emails in there. But my email inbox has, I think, fewer than 10 emails in it right now, which is stark contrast to the start of this week where there were over 300 emails in there, and I was answering about 150 emails a day, and I couldn't bring it down. It was just unrelenting. So I certainly do thank you for all of your interest with this course. It's making it much more interesting to teach, I suppose. And it's very gratifying to know you're actually interested and you're engaging, and you're turning up for live streams as well and consultations. So this is awesome. Hey, Adam. Yeah, schizoaffective disorder can be thought of as something akin to being between bipolar and schizophrenia. That's often the way in which it's conceptualized. That's right. Great. Excellent. Yeah, good. Scrolling back up here, what else have I missed? Have a look at the again the that overview document for the clinical lecture series. It lists which are the core readings and which aren't. So in there, I think I've said the Cozy Luck reading, certainly chapter 24 of the Stigma of Mental Illness book, and also the DSM-5. So the link to the DSM-5 is in that document as well. And you can so you've got access to the DSM-5. Please don't go out and buy one. American Psychological Association needs no more money from anyone. It's got enough. And then as we go through, and the lectures this year are different to the lectures that have come in previous years. The majority, there might be a couple of pieces of slides that have been retained, but for the most part, it's a new lecture series. And I'm trying things out, and things are coming up to me in mind as I put the lectures together, and then I think, oh, okay, this would be an interesting reading to offer up for you. So each week in lectures, I have been uploading files like McGorry's staging model paper, the high top transdiagnostic model paper, and other papers that are just for your interest. They're just there to support your understanding, and they're not prescribed. They're just recommended if you'd like to read on. It's the core readings are just the Cozy Luck paper and the chapter 24. I'm only going to no, so I'm not going to put the any other readings up in perusal except for just the Cozy Luck reading. So there's going to be one core reading for each lecturer that we put in perusal, and then we explore collaboratively with you. And I know some of you might have used perusal before. It's our first time using it, so I'm keeping it simple. I'm not doing all of the things that perusal can do in terms of little assignment tasks and whatnot. We're just going to keep it to exploration and commenting if you want to, and me getting back to you at some point, I promise. All right, let me swing back to Piazza. Okay, so what's the difference between melancholy and depressed mood? Oh, okay, so that's the one we had before. Yeah, so melancholia being very exaggerated, extreme form of depression. Generally, lots of the biological aspects of depression coming through: early awakening, food drive disruption, sleep disruption, and typically, I suppose, probably has much more of a biological component to it than an environmentally reactive depression, where maybe there has been a critical environmental effect that has preceded a depressive episode, and that depressive episode might remit with support and treatment and so forth relatively more easily than we would see in a melancholic presentation, where it might be not necessarily tied to any episode and maybe much more biologically driven. Okay, some questions here about schizophrenia. from Mingji. Okay, Mingji, let me have a look here. Okay. So one question is around some of Bloyler's conception of schizophrenia back from 1911 and where that is in the DSM-5 criteria. So Bloyler's conception is similar to what we see in the DSM-5 criteria to a point, but there's certainly no one-to-one correspondence with the things that he said necessarily. The things that he said comprise schizophrenia and the things that are listed in the DSM-5 to comprise schizophrenia. There are certainly some features that are shared. The name is shared, so I get the confusion. The name is shared, but for the purposes of thinking about the current definition of schizophrenia, rely on the DSM-5. And then there's a question about the sequence of criteria in the DSM-5 around the diagnosis of schizophrenia and whether or not there's a certain sequential time criterion there across those 5 criterion. No. So the only criterion in terms of time course with schizophrenia are that we want to see those active symptoms. If we're going to provide a diagnosis of schizophrenia, we would be looking for those active symptoms to have been present for a month or greater, and we're seeing that dysfunction and the disturbance is lasting for at least 6 months. So that's what we're talking about with schizophrenia. Generalized anxiety disorder comorbidity. So we have a question here from Lauren who's asking about generalized anxiety disorder comorbidity being higher for depression than for panic disorder. Yes, that's true, although still, both quite meaningfully highly comorbid disorders. And is that higher than for schizophrenia and for other disorders? Yes, that is the case. Now, you do commonly see anxiety in psychosis, very commonly. And generalized anxiety disorder has a higher crossover with panic disorder than depression does. Oh, I see what you're saying now. With the prevalence rates that you've attached there at the top of your message, Lauren. Yes, yep, that is all right. You've got that on all under control. It makes complete sense. Depression, anxiety disorder, panic disorder, they're all very highly comorbid conditions. I talked about, I think in the first lecture, that I'd had my own experiences with mental health issues. Panic disorder was my little baby. So I would have met criteria for panic disorder back in 2012, and thankfully haven't had a problem for quite a while. But I know that I need to keep my eye on it, especially at times like now. So I'm under great work stress right now. So I'm trying to be very mindful about how I conduct my work and how I try and balance things out with life generally. And I know that I have to look out for early warning signs like becoming irritable and becoming frustrated. That is one of my really good early warning signs, and certainly a big part of this week for me has been becoming irritable and frustrated. But I also know that a relatively quieter time is coming up in about a week, so everything's under control. But certainly, whilst I had experienced, in particular, panic disorder, and that was the most, I suppose, acute experience that I'd had, I do have an ongoing experience of anxiety that's not too bad, actually. It certainly wouldn't meet criteria for disorder, but I just keep an eye on it. And in terms of depression, I'm pretty good. I certainly haven't had any major depressive episodes, for example, but statistically speaking, quite lucky in that respect, I suppose. All right, PTSD and panic disorder. Yeah, so you can absolutely see panic around PTSD. That makes sense, doesn't it? With all of that psychophysiological arousal, one might expect to see that you could also see panic and PTSD comorbid. There's so many, this is one of the things that I've been trying to, I suppose, introduce subtly to you. This idea of comorbidity, it's very common in undergraduate and especially first year clinical psychology, psychopathology, that you would introduce just like the DSM-5 model and don't complicate it, just so people can get a feel for what anxiety is, what depression is, what psychosis is, and what personality disorder is, essentially. And I'm trying to strike a balance here between giving you an opportunity to develop those fundamental concepts, but also entertaining these ideas of transdiagnostic processes and dimensional nature of mental health issues, and that certainly things are not as simple as one person experiences one thing in one box and nothing else. It's all a little bit more interleaved very commonly. And I hope I'm not overcomplicating things. I've certainly ended up introducing you to things that I didn't think I was going to in a couple of months ago, but everybody's so engaged that I figure you can, and everybody seems to be handling it so far. Anxiety. What's the hereditary statistics for PTSD, generalized anxiety, and and panic disorder? I am not sure, Lauren. You could go and look that up if you like. The social rejection of former mental patients. Okay, I know this work. So while the majority of research shows that labels don't really affect stigmatization, well, that's I hope I haven't misleadingly given you this impression, but let me read on. What this paper shows is that labels indicate to the public potential dangerousness of mental disorder, stigmatizes social distance. I'm not precisely sure I understand what this question is, but let me just give some commentary about labels. So I did mention in my lecture on stigma, in passing, I gave the example of label change as being not a great example of what works to reduce stigma about mental illness. The findings in the area are mixed from my from my perspective, there's nothing conclusive that indicates that label change in a Western culture is going to be really useful. Indeed, if it's going to be useful, it's going to be useful short term and nothing else. Because if we think about this from a learning and conditioning perspective, whatever it is you call the thing that is stigmatized, there's something inherently stigmatizing about whatever the thing is. Call it what you want. Change the name all the time. It will only take a matter of time until those inherently stigmatizing characteristics are, again, subject to stereotyped attributions and prejudicial emotional and behavioral responses in terms of discrimination and so forth. Relabeling disorders is not a new idea. Bloiler relabeled dementia precox in part, he wrote, because of the stigma that had become attached to dementia precox. Now, don't forget that Kraepelin coined the term dementia precox only 13 years before Bloiler coined the term schizophrenia. So in only 13 years, the new term had become stigmatized. And this is, I think an important lesson to learn from history, that a label will become stigmatized in time if it's attached to something, paired with something that is stigmatized. The label's not the really important thing. Having said that, there are many subtleties and nuances around psychiatric labels that can affect and elicit different types of public stigma according to exactly what type of label it is. If the label gives a psychosocial sort of feeling to the etiology of the disorder, then the types of stigmatized responses that we can see coming out can be around blame, for example, personal blame for the condition. If the label is instead biological in flavor, sort of neurobiological sounding in terms of the label, we can see stigma coming out around impressions that the person will never get better, for example, or somewhat of a lost cause. And we know that any label itself, indeed Pat Corrigan, who again is one of the world's most prolific stigma researchers, would say that any label is a sign of difference, it's a sign of otherness, and it's essentially another signpost, another stimulus that would become imbued with stigmatized negative attributions and stereotypes and so forth. I am going to jump back to the chat channel and see what's happening there as we continue to work through these questions. Hey, Emily, yes, asking about panic attacks is fine. So Emily asks, I'm curious about panic attacks. When does someone who is panicking, anxious, meet criteria for having a panic attack? Well, you remember what the criteria were, right? There were a number of criteria, and we were looking for 4 or more of those criteria to be present. Happens really quickly in a 10-minute period. So, for me, the paresthesias were definitely a thing. For example, that prickly burning sensation on the skin, dizziness, tightness in the throat, the feeling of choking, the heart palpitations, the sense of panic. That was the thing. And thankfully, it only took a couple of attacks for me to realize, oh, I know what is going on here. And it made sense because at the time, it was a really difficult time for me. I'm always busy, just like always busy, but it is my MO. But that was a really challenging time. I was finishing my PhD at the University of Melbourne. I was running a range of national telephone and online helplines like the Suicide Callback Service and Beyond Blues Info Line and Men's Line and Suicide Line Victoria and all of these sorts of things. I had a really high pressure executive role there. I had a father who was dying at the time, and a mother who was also very unwell. So it was the perfect storm, and it was the perfect storm for things basically to get out of control, out of my control. And so the way that I expressed that psychological distress was through panic attacks. And it was probably a little bit deeper than that around some of the suicide-related work as well. But thankfully, I saw what was happening really quickly, and hopefully this is a skill that you now have under your belt. You know the various signs and symptoms of different experiences and different disorders. So it only took me, I think, 1 or 2 attacks to realize what was going on, saw a psych, got some help, responded to treatment really well and really quickly. So that was excellent. For me, cognitive therapy all day long. So effective for me. I find cognitive therapy just to be the bee's knees, and mindfulness as well is something that I find really great too. And, you know, we're nearly 10 years down the track now, and I really haven't had another problem since. But as I said, you know, I need to keep my eye on you know, the environmental situation, and I think that's something we can all do. And indeed, our next tutorial is going to point out some of those things. And indeed, it's just made me think about, and I think I shared via social media, and I did hashtag MBB2, some mindfulness and resilience, excuse me, online courses that we had, that we've developed. They're really helpful for people at the moment around COVID, and they're free, and there's something you can access. So I will make an announcement later on reminding people about those resources that are probably really useful for maintaining mental health right now for you all. Hey, Daniel, you're very welcome. Very, very happy to share. And so one of the reasons that I do share as well is because I'm very much aware that there is a myth in the student population. It was present, you know, all the way through my education and training, that you can't become a psychologist or work in the area of clinical psychology and mental health if you've got your own lived experience, which is such bullshit. Pardon the pun. Not really a pun, just frankness. So it's not true. As I said, it's a continuum of experience, right? And we all, more or less, actually do have some degree of lived experience and insight into what's going on. And if one has had lived experience themselves, more than likely you've got more empathy and more insight into what the experience of something like panic disorder might be. So, you know, you should, if you do have your own lived experience, do not worry that this precludes you from furthering your study and education and work in the area of mental health. That's not a thing at all. If anything, it's a strength. So I hope that helps some. Daniel asks if I think depression is associated with procrastination and not being able to achieve goals. Hell yes. Many different things are, and depression is certainly one of those things that's related to procrastination. I don't know if you're familiar with the Pomodoro technique. Do you guys remember that we started doing the Pomodoro practice towards the end of Mind, Brain, and Behavior 2? and it's a great way to break procrastination and to start and maintain work on something. Did you find that useful in at the end of Mind, Brain, and Behavior 1? Did people try the Pomodoro technique to help them start working and forward progress work on anything at all? Maybe we can do it again. Maybe we start again soon. We give it a try. Maybe I'll hold a session where basically we will pick a task, and I'd encourage you to pick the lab report, and we set a timer basically, and we'll start with small time intervals, maybe 5 minutes at a time. We'll turn off all of our other distractions and we'll just work for that 5 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes off. Excuse me. And we'll discuss and socialize and reinforce. And then we'll gradually expand that time. Pomodoro. See, Monica. Pomodoro as in tomato in Italian. Oh, Jesus, don't mention Italian to me right now. I'm having Italy withdrawals. Oh my God. Mama seriously needs some Europe in her life. Stat. So I should have been in Europe this year by now, and I have not been. It is no good. High functioning depression or anxiety can be linked to someone who's a workaholic. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I talked earlier on about irritability. So particularly one of my sort of personality related traits, and I need to keep an eye out for, is perfectionism. La Bella Vita. Perfectionism can also lead to procrastination, for example. I think this is a very common experience. So if you want something to be perfect and just right and amazing, then that can all of a sudden create a problem. Where if you need something to be so perfect, then how could you even start it? So if you need your assignment, you want it to be so good, how can you even start? So maybe we start doing the Pomodoro technique together, and that will help and give us all a tool that we can use and bring to bear when we are feeling like we can't start something. Oh, you miss your mum's dumplings. Oh, no. I know. COVID sucks. Many people are missing many things. All right, let me jump back into the Piazza message board, and let's keep busting through these messages. How am I going for time? Holy dooly. Okay, we've been going for an hour and 20 minutes. Good. All right, let's catch up with this discussion board and we'll keep going. Cross-sectional diagnosis. Rima asks, in the fourth lecture, I mentioned the cross-sectional diagnosis. What exactly is this and why is it a problem? Cross-sectional diagnosis is a problem because our experience of mental health and illness and mood and emotion and anxiety and depression and cognition and everything to do with ourselves psychologically fluctuates over time. So if we make a cross-sectional diagnosis, in other words, a diagnosis that's based upon one point in time, it's not going to necessarily be valid for us at any other point in time. I mentioned to you last week the importance of conceptualizing a diagnosis actually as a working hypothesis that's subject to change, because our experiences change and develop over time. And additionally, the information that we're going to feel comfortable to share with our psychologist, or even that we'd have insight into to share with our psychologist, will change over time. So cross-sectional diagnoses can potentially be problematic in the case of Schneiderian first-rank symptoms. So this is Schneider put forward this idea of the first-rank symptoms, such as hearing your own voice aloud, voices commenting on what you're doing, speaking to each other in the third person, and so forth, passivity phenomena, and so forth. All of these things are what am I thinking of? They can be experienced in other disorders as well. It's not valid to form a diagnosis of schizophrenia based on just those things. Sure, we might see some of those things more commonly in schizophrenia, but we'd say they're not pathognomonic for the disorder. They're not only seen in the disorder. All right, let's have a look here. So, Manraj has asked some questions about depression. So firstly, about the behavioral model. So the behavioral model is about the behavioral aspect of depression and the fact that if our behavior that might involve us being active and operant in the world, having influence on the world, interacting socially with others and so forth, if that's not being reinforced, our rate of behavior is going to decrease. So if it's not being rewarded, and if our rate of behavior is going to decrease and we're going to then offer less operant behavior, it's going to be less likely to be reinforced again, and it's going to decrease even further. This is why in a program of something like cognitive behavior therapy, quite often you'd start with a behavioral treatment phase where you are going to look to turn that downward spiral of behavioral depression on its head and start to look for easy wins, so to speak. So start to look for opportunities to be behaviorally reinforced and increase the rate of behavior that somebody is performing, and open up opportunities for reinforcement and celebration and reward. So you might ask somebody to keep an activity diary, for example, and ask your client to keep a list of everything that they do over a week's period, and rate each activity in two dimensions. One being pleasure, how pleasurable was the activity on a scale of 1 to 10, and the other being mastery, how much of a sense of accomplishment did the activity give the person, on a scale of 1 to 10. So both pleasure and mastery are reinforcing and will contribute to an increase in the rate of behavior that is offered when paired with that behavior. So, for example, pleasure is easy to understand. Mastery, maybe if you are studying for the research methods component of mind, brain, and behavior too, but you and you start to feel like you really understand and you've got these statistical concepts under your belt, that's going to be reinforcing. It makes you feel good. You feel confident. You've really mastered that content. You've got a sense of achievement and of accomplishment. It might not necessarily be enjoyable, but there's a sense of accomplishment that can be reinforcing. So you get your client to keep a track of what activities were pleasurable and gave a sense of mastery, and then once you map those out, you would find which of those activities that the client did over the course of the week were relatively high in terms of pleasure or mastery, and you would ask the client to then start to schedule in such activities on a regular basis and do them to combat that behavioral model of depression. And I think we've already talked about Beck's cognitive model. And so we'll talk about the ABC model, again, of emotion and behavior. So very quickly, again, the A is the antecedent, the activating event, the thing that comes before. The B is what you believe about that thing, the environmental event. And then the C is the consequence in terms of how you feel and you behave from that point forward. And I gave that experience, didn't I, of somebody walking past you and ignoring you as being an activating event. But let's choose another one. Let's say that oh God, come on, imagination. Let's say that you are a grandparent and you are looking after your grandchildren, and they're being little terrors, and they run around the house and they break something that's very valuable to you, and you tell them off. You say, no, that's not okay, and you chastise them. So let's think about that chastising as an event. If you were to think about that activating event, so if you were to believe, now thinking about the B, through the lens of that being something you should never do. You should never get angry with your grandchildren. This is just something that grandparents should not do. You should never be angry with your grandchildren. Then as a consequence, you're going to probably feel shame. You'll feel maybe tense. You'll feel maybe nauseous a little around the experience, maybe flushed. And in terms of the behavioral consequence, you might hide what's happened. You might not tell your daughter or son, your child who is the parent of the grandchildren. You might not tell them what's happened. You might withdraw from child sitting for a period of time. But if you instead had a more adaptive belief that you were that was righteous, that was a righteous correction that you gave to the children. They were little shits, and you had every right to shape their behavior through, some verbal punishment, because they were being bad, and you've actually, in doing so, helped or contributed to their learning about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate behavior. Then how are you going to feel as a consequence? You're going to feel okay, right? You're not going to feel loathsome or shamed. You're going to feel just okay. And what would happen in terms of behavioral outcomes? Probably nothing. You might just say to your daughter they were little terrors, or your son, or the parent of the child, they were little terrors, and I had to tell them off. You might just be completely honest, and there's nothing to hide, and there's no maladaptive behavioral outcome. So another example of the ABC paradigm. You can probably apply it to a range of things in your life. You can even try coming up with your own examples, and that would be good. Hope that helps. Thank you, Paul. Paul gives a good answer to Claire. Yep, the research methods for Mind, Brain, and Behavior 1 are available in Canvas in our modules. You can go and do that if you'd like to do some brushing up on what happens with research methods in Mind, Brain, and Behavior 1. Okay, some good questions here from Manraj. So the difference between major depressive episode and major depressive disorder, we touched on that already, didn't we? So this is that the episode, the disorder is diagnosed if the episode is present and is not otherwise explained by another disorder or a medical condition or a substance and so forth. And what does epidemiology mean? So when we talk about epidemiology, we're talking about the examination of, in this case, a mental health disorder at a population level. So we're talking about population prevalence rates, and we could look at that in different respects. We could look at point prevalence or incidence, so having a look at how many cases, new cases occur in a certain period of time. We could look at lifetime prevalence, how many cases occur over one's lifetime. And population prevalence rates are predominantly determined either by something like a national survey that's conducted by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, or by mining data from the mental health system and health systems. So actually, this is a really good point that's raised by Katya. So Katya asks about the learning outcomes for the schizophrenia spectrum disorders. That they're a little bit stuck on the idea of comparing and contrasting different types of schizophrenia spectrum disorders. So we talked about two other types of schizophrenia spectrum disorders, but we mentioned them in passing. So we talked about schizoaffective disorder, that also it has the features, psychotic features that we would see in schizophrenia, but also has mood disruption, predominantly depression and potentially mania as well. What we also talked about was schizophreniform disorder. Do you remember schizophreniform disorder? Again, this can have the shared features of schizophrenia. In fact, one could have exactly the same set of symptoms, and if the duration of dysfunction was between 1 and 6 months, then we'd be talking about schizophreniform disorder. If it was less than 1 month, we might be talking about brief psychotic episode. More than 6 months would be talking about schizophrenia. So we can differentiate between different types of disorders based on symptom configuration or based on the duration of dysfunction and of impact and of the experience, the disturbance. Let's have a look here. Well, this is a really long question. Oh, okay, but a really good question. So, Kelly here asks about biological predisposition, genetics, and familial contributions to mental disorder, and asks pragmatically, where does this factor into the process of going to seek help for a mental health problem? A really good question. We haven't really talked about how it actually works when you go to seek help. So if you were to go and see a psychologist, the initial session or sessions are going to be certainly about assessing what types of immediate support you require and providing that immediate support, but also very focused on assessment, on exploring and understanding and formulating a picture of what is going on for the person that has gone to see the psychologist. And certainly in that initial assessment interview or interviews or sessions with the psychologist, you would be asking about familial history of mental disorder. It's absolutely something you would be taking into account as you formulated, I suppose, what would be a far more nuanced and sophisticated picture of what would be going on for your client, incorporating history, familial history, in terms of their social environment, their history, their biopsychosocial contributors to their current experience, what's set the scene, what might have precipitated the current issue, and what's maintaining the issues. There, obviously, we just don't have time in the course to dig down into the complexity that is this process, but certainly know that the process is far more in depth and sensitive and bespoke to every individual person, rather than having somebody come in and tick off the criteria in the DSM-5 and then commence treatment. I hope that makes sense. There's also a question here, a second question around intergenerational trauma, which is a whole another issue. And I am working on bringing in someone to have a discussion with me and you about intergenerational trauma. And that will be likely Mark Cross. I don't know if you've heard of Mark Cross. He's a psychiatrist from New South Wales. He's just written a book about his experience of severe anxiety and being a psychiatrist, and how that experience has been for him. He's also the creator of the ABC Changing Minds program. If you've seen that program before, you'll know it's a wonderful show that follows the experiences of people admitted to an inpatient facility for some severe mental health problems. And there's numerous series of it. And what was I going to say? If you haven't watched it already, search our university library for Changing Minds. We've got access to all of the episodes, and it's a great TV series. And Mark has expressed that he's really keen to speak with you. So we'll make that happen. It won't be in a lecture. We'll have another live stream like one of these chats. How's the chat channel going here? Oh, lots of questions. Oh, and Kelly, okay, Kelly's gone, but I think we just answered a question. That's good. Yeah, exposure can be a part of treatment for a range of anxiety-related conditions. Graduated exposure, imaginal exposure. There's quite a range of techniques that one can apply. All right, let's have a look. So we're getting some redundant questions now. I can see others talking about anxiety epidemiology. We've sort of done that. When is the lab report due? Oh my God, girl. 21st of September, 21st of September at 8 a.m. If you haven't yet checked out the subject manual, make sure to read the subject manual and have a look at that orientation video that I recorded, and it's pinned to the homepage. And that is a good guide to all of the important dates and things that are going on with Mind, Brain, and Behavior 2. So where are the readings? The readings are in Readings Online, of course, and again, just those core readings, the Cozy Luck one and the chapter 24 of the mental illness end of story paper, they are your core readings. The other ones I'll just trickle out for your interest. And of course, you've got access to the DSM-5 as well. The link is in that clinical psychology course overview document that's just above the Hearing Voices module. So here is another really good question about the lab reports. So Alana says that they've watched the first lecture and realized something about the survey that they were thinking about while completing it, and that it doesn't allow an option for responding differently in different contexts. So maybe I would be comfortable to interact with somebody with lived experience in this context, but maybe not that context. It didn't allow for that, did it? I forced you into one particular way of thinking about things when you've responded, or have I? This is something that you can discuss in the limitations section of your lab report. Is this a limitation? There's some other questions here about the fact that I have phrased the survey around the experience of mental illness only, and I haven't given any specific example like schizophrenia. So what does that mean? Does that mean it's a problem? No, not necessarily. It's just setting the scene. So and that defines the parameters for your survey and your study. So, for example, if you were to instead take the very specific granular route and phrase all the questions around schizophrenia, then your study is specifically about schizophrenia, and you would have limited ability to draw broader inferences. But here we're taking the opposite approach. We're talking about mental illness more broadly in our study and stigma about mental illness more broadly in our study. And that comes with limited ability to extend our findings to any particular diagnostic group where there may be differences in stigma. So it's really about choosing a particular approach, but being mindful of the parameters and the limitations of that approach, and being... losing my voice, and being transparent in your reporting and measured in your reporting of limitations, I suppose, around that. Hi, Monica. Do you have to cite audio-visual material? No, you don't have to cite the audio-visual material. That is, unless you want to. If you want to, you can, and there are ways to do it. And we haven't even got to the point yet where we've discussed how the tutors will be supporting you with your assignment development, but we will be getting to that point and supporting you around all of those really technical issues like APA style and so forth. And there's ways to do it in APA style. Zoom link location. That's something we don't need to answer. Okay. Here's a good question. So somebody here is asking, oh, this question is very familiar. Have I answered? Oh, I have answered this on the board, but let me answer it here as well. Somebody's asking here about the fact that we know the study is now about stigma, about mental health problems. What does that mean for our responses at our second survey, which will happen late next week? So remember, next Thursday morning, Sandy Jeffs and I deliver the last clinical lecture to you. As soon as that lecture finishes, the survey goes live for the second time. And I'll ask you all to complete the survey again. I would ask you to complete it objectively at the second time. But what if we bring our own biases to bear in the completion of that survey at the second time? Could that influence the results? Could people respond in a socially desirable way because they know that we're aiming to look to see if there's evidence here with this particular teaching package that it's effective in reducing stigma about mental illness? Sure, that's a problem, isn't it? Again, that conniving researcher has built all these flaws in there for you to find. So, yeah, that could be a problem. And what should you do about that? Report it transparently. So, again, in the discussion section, in the limitations section, oh, Mama is losing her voice. Oh, dearie me. You could mention it there. It's not dire. It's not the end of the world. In fact, maybe once this is all done, I'll tell you how I would do this study for real. Would that be helpful? So once we've done the second round of testing, maybe then I'll tell you exactly how, if I was going to do this for real, legitimately, how I would go about doing it. And it will be much tighter than what we are doing, of course. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for taking care of the chat channel. Much appreciated. Okay. So there's a really interesting question here on the discussion board entitled "Sympathy for the Paranoid?" question mark. And it's sort of getting at this idea of, why we might expect paranoia to be a part of mental health issues such as schizophrenia, for example, and we might feel like we should be portraying empathy towards those types of experiences. What about other elements of paranoia that we might see people sharing around on Facebook, like there's no COVID, or COVID's caused by 5G, or it's all a government conspiracy, or the Earth is flat, etc., etc. You mean the Earth's not flat? What? How should we feel about those? I suppose more common elements of paranoia that occur for people outside of the mental health spectrum. I'm never going to tell you how you feel, how you should feel. But again, here's an interesting example of how things that we talk about in the context of mental health issues are quite commonly observed in everyday life in attenuated forms. And I hear you, the person who has submitted this question, Geordie. I certainly hear this question. Interesting question. Is it desirable, essentially? Is it proper to, should we be compassionate for people who are paranoid but not mentally ill? So I know what you're getting at, Geordie. I think literally every time I open Twitter, I'm just like, oh my God, I can't do it anymore. I just can't. When I read some of the stuff that I see on Twitter around these themes. But I think understanding is the key to empathy here. And you don't want to get caught up in frustration, right? So you find your empathy, you'll be experiencing more likely a positive state in response. So probably understanding that you might have had a different education and experiences to those sorts of people, and just trying to, be respectful of diverse opinions on any particular thing. And in fact, this is a really important thing that's going to come out next week around the exploration of art at the DAC Centre. It's going to be an opportunity for us to respectfully put forward our diverse opinions and thoughts and interpretations about the art that's been produced by people who've lived experience in an open forum, either in Zoom breakout rooms or amongst the practical class more broadly. And it's really important, I think, for us to listen and to try and understand other people's points of view about any particular thing. That's just my approach. All right, let's do a quick burst to get through the remainder of the questions. Okay, somebody's asking here about the P factor in the Dunedin birth cohort study. That is a general psychopathology factor. If I feel like I've put something else, where else would the P factor be referred to? So you may also find the P factor referred to in the in the high top model paper. You will see the P factor, the general broad measure of psychological, of mental ill health, basically, is what we're talking about with the P factor. Good question. So the study assessed participants between 3 and 45 years old and states participants were given written informed consent. So they probably should have elaborated there. So really good question here by Kelly, which is, how could a 3-year-old possibly give consent? The 3-year-old would not have given consent, although one would hope they would have additionally in some way, but the parents, the caregivers, the guardians would have given informed consent. All right. So next question, can we consider the clinical staging model to be under a trans diagnostic framework? I mean, yes, to a point. I think it's most usefully applied to psychotic schizophrenia spectrum disorders, although you could certainly adapt and apply it to a range of experiences. That's just where I've had the most experience with it. And yes, you could establish it in a transdiagnostic sense, in that the focus could be very much on symptoms and signs of experience that traverse different disorders within, but I think in terms of clinical utility, that would have to be married with some degree of constraint, maybe constraining any individual model to disorders that have strong shared features, like schizophrenia spectrum disorder. So within a cluster, so to speak, there would be limitations to, I think, to how sort of transdiagnostic you could take that and actually have it rendering any sort of clinical utility. Another question about the book chapter. Okay, that's an easy one. We've done that. Due date for readings. There's no due date per se, unless I tell you there is. So we wanted, of course, the sooner you get across the core reading for clinical psychology, the better, given that we're about to start talking about your lab report in practical classes. Get that cozy luck reading done soon if you haven't done it already. A repeated measures design. Is there a certain amount of difference required between the social distance scale results to be able to say that the Mind Brain Behavior 2 clinical course was effective? Yeah, So yes is the basic answer. So if we were to statistically subject the mean score at time 1 and the mean score at time 2 to a difference test that would basically test statistically if the difference between those two mean scores was 0 or different to 0, the further apart they are, so the higher or lower they are, and the further apart they digress, the more we would say there would be a greater effect of the intervention. So if this is your time 1 score and your time 2 scores dropped way down in terms of symptoms, in terms of stigma and decrease of stigma as measured by the social distance scale, then the statistical test will come up with a super significant result and point out a really big what we call an effect size, which is a quantitative measure of the effect of the thing that you're testing, in this case, an intervention. If it was a more borderline decrease, then there might not be a difference that's significantly picked up by the difference test. The difference test I'm going to be using and sharing the results of with you is called a repeated measures t-test. And it's something you'll learn about in practical classes, and it's something that builds on the latter research methods modules that you have in the Mind, Brain and Behavior 2 Canvas page. Okay, so I think we're nearly getting there. Is hearing voices examinable? Not directly, no, except for this last lecture coming with Sandy and I'm going to ask a couple of exam questions about it. What are they going to be? I don't know. I will be forming them once I have actually done this live stream discussion with Sandy and so forth. All right, I think that's as many questions as we can. I'm starting to see a lot of redundancy now, questions that we have addressed already as I cycle down through the Piazza list in the digital mailbox. The lecture is too quiet. Yes, I know. I tried to ramp up the audio this week. My microphone that I'm not going to touch, which is just down here. It's a good mic, Razer mic, but it is... I think it's on its last legs. So I was very happy hearing your feedback. Very happy to pick up a new baby this week. So hopefully Mum is going to sound all smooth and buttery very shortly. We'll see. Okay, so how's this chat going? Still got 26 people hanging in there. Good on you guys. So we've done 2 hours. Amazing. Big session, right? Thank you, everyone. Is there anything else that I can finish up by answering? Doesn't look like there's a lot of new stuff in the chat window right now. What time's the Hearing Voices lecture next week? 10 o'clock. I think we said 10 o'clock, didn't we? 10 o'clock next Thursday. I'll put an announcement out about that on Monday. Hey, Taylor, you just need to know really about schizophrenia. That's the major thing. You could just know that there is also schizophreniform disorder that's differentiated by duration, and also schizoaffective disorder as well. It's got that affective component to it too. That's all you need to know. But in terms of anything that I ask about schizophrenia on the exam, it'll be very much about, it will be about things that I've asked talked about in the lecture. Hey, Nancy, you don't necessarily have to attend the Hearing Voices lecture live. However, it would be great if you do, and I'm expecting there to be a really great turnout. If it's anything like last year, it is your unique experience to have a one-on-one session with somebody with lived experience of schizophrenia, and you can ask Sandy anything about that experience, and she will be very happy to answer you and tell you about what it's actually like to live with schizophrenia. And we'll talk about a range of things. Of course, we'll be mindful when we are asking Sandy questions, just to be really sensitive and respectful with the way that we're asking those questions. Hey, Tom, so the difference between specifiers and criteria is that the specifiers elaborate upon the criteria and they provide more rich information. This is not only the case for major depressive episode and disorder, it's the case for basically every DSM disorder. So the specifiers provide more information about illness factors, about treatment relevant factors, and so forth. Okay, team. Well, I have to now get ready to brief the tutors about your tutorials. Excuse me, your practical classes that are coming next week. So I hope you found this extended get-together useful. We needed to catch up on some questions, didn't we? So I think we covered a lot. And what I'm going to do now is take this recording and I'm going to pin it into Piazza at the top of the week 2 digital mailbox. I'll take last week's recording, pitch it at the top of the week 1 mailbox. And then, of course, we'll have another consultation next week, and that will be our week 3 clinical psychology digital mailbox. I'll have to set that up in Piazza today for you all. So next week we've got our personality disorder lecture, our live stream with Sandy and myself, and then that's it. Very sad. That's it for clinical psychology, but I will be very happy to pass you over to the wonderful Dr. Abby Brooker, and I'm being very sincere when I say wonderful, because there are very few people on staff at the university that are as passionate about teaching as Abby is. And I know that you're going to have incredible experience with her as you explore developmental psychology. Cool. All right, team. Well, thank you very much for coming out. It is very appreciated to see you all engaging. Again, it makes it worthwhile. So thank you very much. I hope you all have a nice day and a nice weekend. I've actually got my blinds shut, so we've got the nice lighting in here, but I'm sure it's a nice day out there. Not that we can really go out. That's no good, is it? Can we go out? I don't know where we're at with lockdown restrictions. I'm locked down in my own office. Maybe we should do another Mind, Brain, and Boogie. Is Mama in the mood to shake a tail feather? Potentially. We'll see. Okay. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Julie. Thanks, Taylor, Stephen Lee, Monica, Tom, Yuan. Oh, Yuan. I think I just responded to an email of yours. Taylor and everyone, thanks for coming out. Have a great weekend, yeah? And I will talk to you again really soon. Okay, everyone, take care. Bye now.